Let's talk templates. This is one of the more common questions that I get from a lot of my ticketing clients. There's just a lot of confusion about what you need when you include a template in your quilt pattern, also when you need a template, when you don't, and what are the best practices surrounding that. So we're going to talk through it today. What I have here is just a traditional Drunkard's Path quilt block. It's just one kind of quarter circle curve seam that's characteristic of these blocks, and this would be a typical block that you would need to include templates for. In general, anytime you've got curves in your quilt pattern, you're going to need templates, but you'll also need them if you're including any kind of straight-edged irregular pieces. So think equilateral triangles, diamonds, hexagons, anything like that that you would typically need a specialty ruler for, you're going to want to include templates for, even if you're recommending to use a specialty ruler in the quilt pattern. So there are 4 elements that are really critical to include anytime you have templates in your pattern. The first is the pattern name on the template, and that's because these things are meant to get printed out and cut out, and they're going to get separated from the pattern. As we all know, anytime you've got loose paper floating around your sewing room, it's really easy for that to get lost, and then you find it a month later and you pick it up and go, I have no idea where this came from or what it goes to. It's just going to go in the bin. Not ideal. So if you have the pattern name on the template itself, it makes it really easy. The other things that you want to include are copyright statement as well as your logo. And that, again, just helps with your branding. And also in case somebody decides to make a Instagram reel or YouTube video or something like that, shows your templates in that video or picture, you can still get credit for them because you've got a copyright statement on them, letting everybody know that they're yours. They're not just in the public domain, as well as your branding saying that they belong to your quilt pattern. The final thing is something that I see a lot of people leaving off, and that is seam allowance lines. And it's easy to justify why you might not need these because you're cutting on the outside line, not the inside line. It's just there as a reminder that you have a seam allowance included. But the reason I always include them and encourage people to include them as well is because the straight edges on these templates are much, much easier cut when you have a 1/4 inch line that you can kind of align the 1/4 inch line on your ruler up to and then have a straight ruler edge to cut against than, tracing it out and cutting it out with scissors or just doing it freehand with a rotary cutter. It's nice to have kind of a nice straight edge to cut against. And it's hard to get that alignment correct if you don't have a 1/4 inch line on it. So that's why I always like to include seam allowance lines. The last piece is something that I also see super frequently, and I'm seeing more and more lately as people realize that a lot of quilters like to trim down their curved blocks because curves are hard to sew on the first try. You don't always get that seam perfect. And so it's nice to have a little extra wiggle room to deal with in order to trim that block up and get it looking really good before you sew into the rest of your quilt. So a lot of people will start to add a little extra trimming room on their templates. And what I see really frequently with a lot of my ticketing clients is that they'll add kind of bulk around the entire piece. So you'll have your inner seam allowance lines. That'll be the finished shape. So if you've got a 6-inch circle, that inner shape will be 6 inches, but then they'll add, a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the whole edge to give extra room for trimming. The problem with that is that people are still going to sew that curve seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's what all quilting is done with. And if they do that when you have, 3/8 or a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on the template, the points on the curve are not going to line up correctly, and you're going to end up with a curved block that will not lie flat. And that's super frustrating. So you have to keep that seam on the curve at exactly a 1/4 inch. Don't mess with that piece of it. But where you want to add the extra room is just on the straight edges. So in this particular instance, it's on the outer arc template. We've got 4 straight edges there, and I've just gone and added an extra 1/8 of an inch around all of those edges. And we also need it on the inner arc piece around the 2 flat sides on the inside of like the pie wedge. And so you'll sew your 1/4 inch seam and everything will line up correctly. You'll get a nice flat block, and then you just take your quilt ruler and trim off those extra sides. You'll end up having basically a 1/4 inch on each side to play with, which is plenty for most people. But if you wanted to up that, you could just add an extra 1/4 inch to all sides to give yourself 1/2 inch to play with if you prefer. But really, really important that you only add it on the flat sides. Don't add it to the curved edges so that everything will sew nice and flat. Alrighty, if you found this helpful, please like and subscribe, and I will be back next week with another Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!